So our next speaker is Dr. Cassandra Crifasi. She is the Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. She's an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and she's going to talk about background checks and firearm purchaser licensing.
Hi, welcome. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the background check system, but I want to spend just a few minutes talking about it so that when I talk about licensing, we're all sort of on the same page and have some important context. So the federal background check system was established as part of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, and that's what created this requirement for background checks by licensed dealers. When a purchaser wants to buy a gun from a licensed seller, they go and submit themselves for a background check, and they get run through this instant check system, and it really is instant. The vast majority of background checks come back in about 2 minutes. And one of three things happen when a purchaser submits themselves for a background check. The seller can be alerted that the sale can proceed immediately, or they can be immediately denied if the purchaser is prohibited. But there's a third thing that can happen, and that can be a delay. And perhaps more time is needed to complete that background check, to look through some of the records that April had mentioned. And law enforcement has 3 days to complete that background check. If it doesn't come back in the 3 days, the default under federal law is that the seller can proceed with that sale, even if the purchaser is prohibited. If after those 3 days and the sale is completed, the background check comes back as prohibited, then law enforcement has to go and take guns away from people who never should have gotten them in the first place. A challenge with the federal background check system is that states and local law enforcement agencies don't always report prohibiting conditions in a timely manner, and this also applies to mental health prohibitions. So this creates gaps where people who are prohibited, maybe their records haven't yet been reported into the federal system, can obtain firearms even if they shouldn't have them. Another issue with the federal system is that it relies on name and birthday checks, which can miss, some research has found, as many as 10% of prohibiting conditions. Federal law, as we, I'm sure are all aware, doesn't extend this background check requirement for private sales. It only applies to licensed dealers. Sellers aren't allowed to sell to someone that they know is prohibited, but if sellers don't ask and buyers don't tell, then there's really no way to know that that person is prohibited without conducting a background check. Recognizing this gap, 21 states and the District of Columbia have extended background checks for private sales of guns. The other policy that I want to talk to you about is firearm purchaser licensing. So these laws require that anyone who wants to buy a gun apply to state or local law enforcement to get a license. As part of the process, applicants often get their photograph taken. They usually submit fingerprints, at least on that first application. And the use of fingerprints increases the likelihood that someone will be properly identified and screened out from purchasing a firearm if they're prohibited. In fact, fingerprinting is required for most occupational licensing because of the higher quality of a background check and ability to identify those records. Law enforcement has, on average, 30 days to complete that background check, giving them more time to better identify records and, again, screen out those people who have those dangerous conditions, and we've agreed that they shouldn't have firearms. That additional time is really key to make sure that we're not missing records. So if you think back to the Charleston church shooting, the inability to complete that background check in 3 days is what facilitated that individual obtaining that firearm and committing that shooting. That extra time also can delay impulsive acquisition. So if someone is thinking about acquiring a firearm to harm self or others, that delay in time to get the license processed can delay that impulsive acquisition. Importantly, people who want to buy guns in states with licensing have to show their license to every seller, regardless of whether they're licensed or not. And this is really important for increasing accountability. If I'm in a state with licensing and I sell to someone without a license and that gun is then recovered in crime, it's a lot easier to prove that I violated the law because that person didn't have a license and was an ineligible purchaser. So there's some variation across the states that have licensing laws. There are 9 that require a license for all handgun purchasers. Some also require safety training. Some give discretion to law enforcement, and some of the permits last or licenses last for different durations. But the core components are an application to law enforcement and more time to conduct a thorough background check. So what do we know about these policies? So requiring background checks for private sales is associated with lower rates of guns being brought illegally across state lines. So meaning that if a state has a background check law for private sales, it's less likely that those guns are going to end up in crime in another state. And background checks are a really important foundation for other policies to work. We heard about the importance of background checks for domestic violence prohibitions. If a state has other prohibitions, like Florida has a minimum age law, if you don't require background checks for private sales, you create an avenue where people can avoid undergoing a background check and get around those prohibiting conditions. However, while background checks are a really important foundation and they're necessary as a robust part of a functioning policy set for identifying prohibited individuals, they haven't yet been enough on their own to reduce gun violence. And that's unless they're paired with this licensing system. This is really due in large part to issues with records reporting and enforcement. It's uncommon for people who violate a background check law to be held accountable for that action. This gap is really creating harms to the public's health and contributing to our burden of gun violence in this country. A primary focus really needs to be on strengthening this system. We need to have better reporting of records, timely reporting. We need to have all purchasers, regardless of from whom they're buying the gun, undergoing a background check. And then we could further strengthen this system by pairing it with a licensing law. So what we know about firearm purchaser licensing laws is that they're very, very good for public safety. These laws are associated with fewer crime guns being traced to within state sales. So often, individuals who are committing crimes in states with licensing get those guns from states with weaker laws. This means that the local source of crime guns are restricted, and it's harder to get a gun within your state. You have to go across state lines. We hear a lot about, gun laws don't work. Look at Illinois, look at Chicago. They have high rates of gun violence, and so obviously these laws aren't working. But of the crime guns, there are about 10,000 crime guns recovered in Illinois last year. About half of them came from sales that originated in Illinois, about half, which is average for a state that has licensing. Of the guns that didn't come from Illinois, most of them came from Indiana, which doesn't have background checks. They don't have licensing laws. So even when a state has strong gun laws, they're at the mercy of states around them that have weaker laws. And in contrast to what we found for background checks, the research on licensing is really strong, and it shows, again, these public safety benefits. Connecticut passed a purchaser licensing law in 1995. They had an in-person application and fingerprinting, and they saw a 40% reduction in firearm suicide and a 15% reduction in firearm suicide in the first 10 years that the law was in place. Missouri repealed a similar law in 2007. They had required an in-person application and had a permit that was good for 30 days. They had a 17 to 27% increase in firearm homicide and a 16% increase in firearm suicide. Additionally, because the repeal of this law freed up their sort of local sources of guns, they saw a dramatic increase in in-state crime gun recoveries. In 2006, about 50% of their guns originated in Missouri. And as of 2018, it was almost 80%. In large urban counties where firearm homicide tends to concentrate, these large urban counties that were in states with licensing had 11% lower rates of firearm homicide. And in the context of mass shootings, that's a common outcome that we talk about, and while it's exceedingly rare, it tends to drive the policy conversation. We have some new research that's forthcoming that found that purchaser licensing laws that had an in-person application and fingerprinting reduced the incidence of mass shootings by 56% and reduced the victims in these incidents by 57%. Because, again, the process of applying for and obtaining this license can delay impulsive acquisition, that can reduce the likelihood that someone can obtain that firearm to harm themselves or others. Background checks enjoy really broad public support. Consistently, they're supported by over 85% of US adults, with very little difference between gun owners and non-gun owners or across the political spectrum. While purchaser licensing laws don't have quite that same level of support, still 75% of US adults support licensing. That includes more than 60% of gun owners who support being required to apply to state or local law enforcement before they can buy a gun. And when you look at gun owners who live in states that already have a licensing law, that support is over 75%. Among African American individuals who live in metropolitan areas, those who are among experiencing the greatest burden of gun violence, their support for licensing is 80%. So we often hear that gun laws are in violation of the Second Amendment and that licensing is going to create this big onerous burden and prevent people from exercising their Second Amendment rights. If that were true, we would expect to see lower levels of support among gun owners who have gone through the process of obtaining a license. But in fact, we see quite high levels of support for this evidence-based policy. So I'm going to wrap up with some recommendations. Congress needs to pass legislation requiring background checks for all gun sales. Individuals should not have an opportunity to buy a gun from a private seller without being subjected to a background check. And unless we close this policy gap, we're going to continue to experience harms to our public health. Congress should also explore the feasibility of establishing a federal licensing system to make sure that all gun owners are thoroughly vetted before buying a gun. In the absence of a federal system, states should complement their background check requirements with a licensing law that includes fingerprinting, an in-person application, and safety training. A really important piece of any policy's functioning is accountability. Are you enforcing it? We've heard about implementation from other speakers. So state and federal law enforcement agencies need to be holding individuals accountable when they violate the law. People who lie and try, people who engage in straw purchase or otherwise make guns available for use in crime need to be held accountable so that we encourage responsible behaviors. And finally, Congress needs to provide incentives to states so that they can support their activities, whether it's policy or some of the community level interventions that we're going to hear about in the second panel. There needs to be resources dedicated to reducing the burden of gun violence through both policy and programs. Thank you.